want to share with you primarily from some cutting edge research that I'm a part of called the Flourishing in Ministry Project, with the assumption that you were created to flourish. We were all created to flourish. That was sort of God's design and intent for us in life, but also in ministry, even in the midst of all the unique stresses and strains that are unique to pastoral leadership, that really are unlike any other job in many ways. And so we'll talk about some of that. And also even in the midst of things like a global pandemic and a polarized culture and society and all the additional stresses that that places upon faith leaders. I want to talk to you about what we know about what is uniquely stressful, what the impact of that stress can be on our well-being, and then what can we do to mitigate that? What can we do to help ourselves live into the kind of flourishing and abundant life that we are, into which we are inviting other people? I want to frame this for you in a particular kind of way. It used to be the thinking in the social sciences and psychology that mental illness and mental health were on the same continuum. That on the left end of the screen there, you see mental illness. So that as you go out further to the left, you would see, depression, anxiety, suffering of various kinds. And then as you move across to the right, you would get to emotional health, intimate relationships, meaningful work, enjoyment in life, the abundant life. And that was the thinking for a long time, but the more recent thinking is that those are actually two different axes that intersect to form four quadrants, such that the upper right is human flourishing. Now you'll notice there that you do have low mental illness. In other words, there's the minimization of the difficulties, but it turns out that's only part of the equation for flourishing. You need to have the absence of the suffering or minimization of that, plus the presence of some things that promote well-being and flourishing to get all the way to human flourishing. And so this is a revolution in social sciences called positive psychology. Some of you may have heard that term. And what I'm going to share with you is what we're learning about not just what prevents depression and some of the other challenges that can come with ministry leadership, but also what promotes flourishing. What are the conditions and practices that flourishing leaders seem to be engaged in to sustain what we call a positive pastoral identity and a sustained positivity over a long period of time. What we find is that a lot of clergy hang out in the upper left corner, in the upper left quadrant, that many pastors would say, I wouldn't trade this for anything in the world. I love what I do. It brings me incredible joy to participate in pastoral duties. And at the same time, I'm exhausted. I experience some anxiety, maybe some depression symptoms. My physical health's not the best. And so those two things coexist side by side. And so I want to help you think about how can you help nudge yourself over toward that upper right-hand quadrant, and how can you care for other clergy that you might care about. I will send all these slides, by the way, so you'll receive a copy of all of these, just to let you know that. I need to mention that this project started at the University of Notre Dame. There's a researcher there by the name of Dr. Matt Bloom, who began this project. His wife is a United Methodist pastor, so he's lived life as a clergy spouse for many years. And it's funded by the Lilly Foundation, so I need to mention that as well. Going on for a little over 10 years. We have somewhere north of 15,000 clergy and growing in the study across Catholic, mainline evangelical traditions, both men and women, diverse racially, ethnically, culturally. And so we feel like we're starting to get a pretty good handle on some things that I want to share with you. We know from previous research what leads to the difficulties, and you all are well acquainted with these if you've been in ministry for any period of time. The unique stress, the exhaustion, the demands that ministry can place on a marriage and family, which are really unique, burnout, depression, those kinds of things. So I'll talk a little bit about those. How do we prevent those? But also want to talk about what we're learning about what promotes the good stuff, what promotes flourishing. We know that well-being for anybody ebbs and flows. Not every day is a great day. Not every day in ministry is a banner day, and we know that there are ups and downs. The question really is a question of what's the dominant tone over time. Because we also know that daily well-being accumulates, both positively or negatively. And what we tend to find with clergy and ministry leaders is that we're always going on to the next urgent thing, because there's always a next urgent thing in ministry. And we don't often enough pause and just take a step back from the flow of life and work to pay attention to what is building up in us, what we're carrying, whether that's positive or negative. If it's positive, we want to dwell on it, allow ourselves to bask in the positive emotion and the gratitude and all those kinds of things. And if we're carrying some negative emotions, anger, grief and loss, whatever that is, or holding our stress in our body in a particular kind of way, but we're not mindful of that, then that can build up to a critical threshold that then creates difficulties that can kind of catch us unaware. We also know that well-being happens in an ecosystem. And so I'm actually moving away from language of clergy self-care. Not that I don't think that's important, because it is important, but I've seen that language sort of used against clergy because it implies that all that needs to happen is we need to take better care of ourselves. And if anything goes wrong at the church, then it's all the pastor's fault. They're not taking good enough care of themselves. Now, most of us probably do need to take better care of ourselves, but that's not all that needs to happen, is it? And I was thrilled to see that you're going to have family systems webinars coming up, because that's really how I would encourage you to think. Think in terms of systems, the marriage and family you're embedded in, if you're married, or the close personal relationships you have, and you're embedded in a inner circle of leaders of some kind, most likely in a congregation, in a community. And you really want to think about the well-being of that whole ecosystem, because that has a direct impact on your well-being as a leader, and vice versa. So think in terms of systems. So after over a decade of research, this is our model of flourishing in ministry. These 4 dimensions: daily well-being, resilience, thriving, and authenticity. And I'm going to briefly unpack each one of these 4. And you can see that there are kind of lines connecting all of them, and we're just now learning how these are interrelated. But the idea here is that there's a virtuous cycle that can happen, where the more daily well-being we experience, it boosts our resilience, which then helps us to thrive more and leads to greater, deeper authenticity, which in turn leads to even greater well-being and even more resilience, and so on. So there's a positive cycle that can happen. There's also a cycle of ill-being that can happen, that's going the other way. And so we're just starting to learn about how those get started and in what order things seem to diminish. And what we know so far is that daily well-being is the first thing to get low for clergy out of these 4 dimensions. It's the first thing to start to take a dip. And if it gets low enough for long enough, it will start to pull down the other 3 dimensions as well. So we'll start with daily well-being for that reason. This is where we talk about our just general sense of well-being, physically, emotionally, just the quality of daily life. Again, not every day is Pollyanna and all sunshine and rainbows, and we know that. But over time, what's the dominant kind of experience that we have of ourselves? And this is where we talk about the impact of stress. Are you more often, over the course of, say, a year or more, experiencing these kinds of things, feeling calm, cheerful, grateful? There's a huge research literature on gratitude now and how important it is to practice gratitude, which, of course, is not a new idea for Christians. Feeling engaged with life and work, enthusiastic, having experiences of awe, perhaps in worship or your personal time with God, feeling joy, those kinds of things. Not that that's going to be every minute of every day, because then we know that's not realistic. But are those things dominant, such that you experience a sustained positivity over time? Now, there are moments and days, maybe even seasons for most anyone in ministry leadership when you experience these kinds of things, feeling frustrated, irritated, There are lots of ways that we're exposed to trauma and loss of other people, which can lead to grief and sadness. Times when we feel anxious, have our own fears, all those kinds of things, because we're human. But if those things become dominant more of the time than the positive emotions, then that's something to pay attention to. And there's some things we can do to help ourselves in that mix. As we have looked at pastoral ministry as a job, and I know it's more than a job, so I don't want to be reductionistic about that. It's a calling, it's a life. But there are some very unique things about it when you look at it alongside even other helping professions, physicians, teachers, social workers, etc. So let me cover these briefly. Ministry is high stakes work dealing with ultimate concerns. In other words, there's spiritual significance tied to what we do. And when that's the case, people tend to be all in with their work. It's not a, I'm just phoning it in, doing the bare minimum for the bare minimum of hours a day, but we tend to be all in with all of life, all of family, all of energy, all of ourselves. And there are many wonderful things about that. There are also some challenging things that come with that, what psychologists call role immersion, being immersed in a role 24/7 in a way that can, if we don't pace ourselves, can lead to some difficulties. Ministry work is incredibly complex. I'll come back to that. It's, I think, perhaps the most complex job description that exists in terms of the number of competencies that it would be nice to be an expert in, and the breadth of those, and switching rapidly between those in any given day. It's just a very unique deal that places very unique demands on a person. Ministry work has a lot of unexpected events, not just like a global pandemic, but in any given week. You've got your schedule mapped out, and all of a sudden there's a tragedy or a death in the congregation or some other sort of crisis. And in my experience, the crises seem to come in clusters. I'm not sure why that is, but I wish they would come one at a time or something. But there's a lot of unexpected and therefore an unpredictability to the schedule. And that's a challenge as well. Sometimes, depending on the context, there can be not enough clarity around what are the priorities, what is the core mission of this particular organization or congregation, and what should a leader be emphasizing in terms of their time and energy based around their strengths, what they uniquely bring to the leadership there, that kind of thing. And so the role ambiguity can also be difficult at times. Digital communication. In this COVID season that we're in, I hear so many pastors say to me they're just so disappointed with the Facebook behavior of people in their congregation or their friends, the way they're treating one another, the way they're treating the pastor. Pastors can now, because of smartphones, get passive aggressive texts and emails at any time of day or night. And it's just hasn't been helpful in many ways. There's wonderful things about technology, like we get to do video conferences and stuff, but there are challenges with that too. And rapid external change, meaning cultural change and the nature of the role changing. One of the things that I've heard many pastors say during and as we move through COVID here is that almost overnight, pastors had to change how they do almost everything that they do in a very short period of time. So I've moved from preaching to a congregation in person to being, being a televangelist in some ways, producing an online service of some kind, doing pastoral care from a distance, not being able to be in person with people, worried about people in the congregation that are more vulnerable than others. All those kinds of things have just upped the ante, if you will, to an already stressful job. I share this quote that's one of my all-time favorite quotes from a friend and mentor of mine who just recently passed away, Dr. Archibald Hart. Some of you may know that name. He was one of the first people to study ministry stress and burnout, starting really back in the 70s and 80s. But the quote is this: pastors don't get into difficulty because they forget that they're pastors. That's not the issue, right? When are you not a pastor? Typically don't forget that that's what and who we are. But we get into difficulty because we forget we're persons. You're a person who's filling this incredibly important and sacred role But the fact that we're human means that we come with limitations, that if we learn to embrace them and participate with them, then that leads to flourishing in ways that sometimes we aren't consciously thinking about in the busyness of ministry. So I want to share with you, what do we know about the health of clergy? And this result I'm sharing with you has been replicated a number of times in lots of different denominational contexts, that clergy have a higher rate and higher risk for what's called metabolic syndrome than the general population of North America. Now, what is metabolic syndrome? If you have 3 of these 5 things: high blood pressure, high triglycerides, which is the bad cholesterol, a low HDL, which is the good cholesterol, and that's actually the more significant risk factor for heart attack than high bad cholesterol. And it typically comes up to where it should be with more exercise for most people. High fasting blood sugar, which of course is connected to diabetes, and then a large abdominal circumference, meaning moving into clinical obesity the way a physician would diagnose that. If you have 3 of those 5 things, you have metabolic syndrome. Well, why does that matter? It matters because metabolic syndrome puts a person at exponentially higher risk for heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, arthritis, lung disease, a bunch of bad stuff that could not only impair our capacity to be effective in ministry, but even could shorten our lives. So the question then is, why are clergy higher in this than the general population? And what we think is happening is back to that role immersion piece. Without realizing it, to meet the demands of a 24/7 job that has unpredictability inherent in it, and then has gotten even more stressful during a pandemic, pastors are overtaxing their stress hormones internally without even realizing that we're doing so. We have this wonderful stress response system built into our brain and body that when we experience challenge or threat or stress, our brain responds to that with, you may have heard about the fight or flight or freeze response. Our brain starts to send resources to our vital organs and our brain, and the things that are essential in surviving threat. But that system was really designed to be short-lived, so that the threat happens, we go into threat response mode, the threat passes, we come back down to baseline rest. The challenge with ministry is that that stress physiology is chronically elevated over a long period of time. And when you combine that with a lack of enough exercise, not enough sleep, the experts say we all need 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, and then not paying attention to healthy nutrition, you get metabolic syndrome. And so there's, what I experience working with pastors and doing this research is that this is often under the radar for pastors, that we don't realize we're overextending ourselves in terms of our stress physiology, our adrenaline, cortisol, all these stress hormones that get released in the body. And we're not taking good enough care of ourselves physically to offset what gets stirred up just by the nature of the work. That also leads to a higher rate of depression among clergy. We think that the rate of clinical depression among clergy in the US is 2 or 3 percentage points higher than that of the general population of the United States. Typically, when I share that with a room full of clergy, nobody is really surprised by that. But the reason I share that with you is just to validate and normalize this. To some extent, there's something about the nature of the job that can be depression inducing at times for really anybody, no matter who you are, what vulnerabilities and strengths you bring into this work. I heard a psychiatrist recently describe being a clergy person as living in a serotonin depleting environment, which I thought was fascinating. The psychiatrists have actually recognized that the chronic stress that comes with ministry suppresses a number of things. It suppresses our immune system. It suppresses the manufacturing of neurotransmitters in the brain that are associated with depression and anxiety, like serotonin. And so I want to normalize that for you, because what I hear often from clergy is they'll say something to me like, I I bet I'm the first pastor you've ever talked to who's this depressed. And of course they're not. And so I can relieve them of that, let them know they have a lot of good company. And we can see, of course, depression throughout Scripture in different ways, and church history. Some of the iconic heroes that we have went through seasons of depression. Well, what can happen is this. Pastors will say to ourselves something like this: I should not be feeling this way. I have a seminary degree. I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm a bishop, perhaps, or whatever. I should not be feeling depressed. And so we kind of internally, quietly beat ourselves up for feeling down, which of course does what to the depression? Just makes it worse. As opposed to what we do for everybody else in our lives, maybe other than ourselves, which is extend compassion, gentleness, grace. Think about seeking professional help when needed. We do know from research that medication, when it's needed, it's not always needed, counseling and lifestyle changes altogether are over 5 times more effective than doing one of those without the other two when it comes to depression and anxiety. And often exercise is more effective than medication for a lot of people as well. So I just want to normalize that for you, encourage you to seek help. And the Hope and Healing Center, I think, can help connect you to that, if I'm not mistaken, Don. I just want to normalize that for you as a clergy person, that if you find yourself in that place, it's not because you're inadequate spiritually or emotionally as a leader. It's because you're a person doing a very complex, inherently stressful job. So what can we do about this daily well-being piece? What we're finding that helps prevent depression and metabolic syndrome and promote flourishing is to practice Sabbath, to take breaks, and to engage in contemplative spiritual disciplines. Not that other spiritual disciplines are unimportant, but contemplative spiritual disciplines, things like silence, solitude, Ignatian spiritual exercises, if you're familiar with St. Ignatius, those kinds of things seem to be most helpful to ministry leaders, to slow down, calm down our stress physiology, and just be with God, just receive from God, seem to be important. And then holy detachment. You need to play. You need to have a hobby, something you can lose yourself in just for the sheer enjoyment of the activity, like a child at play, for at least a half an hour a week or more. Now, why is that helpful? We think it's helpful because when we do that, we not only take a physical break from ministry, but we also take a mental break. I'm guilty of this. My wife would tell you when I'm on my day off or Sabbathing, I'm still working up here, right? The sermon, if I'm preaching, is still percolating always, right? Or that meeting coming up or that deadline. And so doing something that you can engross yourself in that evokes enjoyment is a way to truly detach in a wonderful sense. And what we find in the research is that when we do that, we actually come back to the work with much more creativity, much more productivity, much more efficiency than if we hadn't taken a break and just kind of pushed on through and kept working. So in fact, taking a break and playing, I would argue, is doing something for your congregation and your community and your family, because it's going to sustain your pastoral excellence. Take care of our body. We talked about that, eat, rest, and exercise. More important probably than even other helping professions, to focus on those things as part of the stewardship of ourselves in ministry. And then embracing our limits, having boundaries around time management, things like building margin into your schedule because you know something unpredictable is going to come. You don't know exactly what or exactly when, but it is coming. And so if you have that margin there, it's not as overwhelming. And we really can have more control over our adrenaline than we think that we can. We can stop and kind of appraise any given situation and ask, okay, do I even need to respond to this at all? Even if other people in my church think that I do. Is this a crisis the way I define a crisis? Is this a one alarm fire? And if so, I'll go into one alarm fire mode. Is it a 5-alarm fire? If so, I'll go into 5-alarm fire mode. But what can happen over time is we start indiscriminately responding to everything as if it's a 5-alarm fire, which of course is just stirring up all that stress physiology more than it actually needs to be stirred up to respond to the situation. So learning to respond rather than react, if you've heard that distinction, is also important. Don and Cody, I'm going to pause there for just a second and see if there are any questions about this first dimension, daily well-being, in the chat that I might address a question or two, and then we'll move on to resilience.
Hey, Chris, we do have a few questions that came in. I'm going to want to ask a few of them here, and some of them, for those of you who asked, I'm going to save some of these for the end of the presentation. One of the questions I had is, what is one thing that a pastor can do to improve their daily well-being?
Great question. What we're finding is that small changes make a big difference over time. So please hear this today, not suggesting that you necessarily need to overhaul your entire schedule in life, but I do encourage you toward something like a Benedictine rule of life for yourself, where you're building in practices that help your well-being. So for example, just 5 minutes of silence a day, done every day, consistently over time, will actually make a significant difference in your physical and emotional health and your flourishing, believe it or not. Just 5 minutes. Taking a 20-minute walk at a moderate pace 2 or 3 times a week, done every week, week after week, month after month, will make a significant difference. So there are small things that you can do, and I would encourage you to set those goals that are SMART goals, if you're familiar: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, meaning there's a deadline to it. So you want to challenge yourself a little bit, but also be realistic with what is doable in your schedule. And once that becomes a habit, then you set another goal and add another incremental practice, like the ones that we were talking about here.
Thanks, Chris. I have one more question, and then if we wanted to see if anybody wanted to ask a question personally, but someone was asking, when you were speaking about that Sabbath rest, they were just curious, what day do you honor Sabbath? Would you, especially as a pastor, when can you take your Sabbath?
Yeah, great question. A lot of pastors take off Monday, understandably, because Sunday can be a 16-hour day or whatever. However, a lot of pastors experience what I call the Monday blues on Mondays. So you wake up, you're a little foggy headed, a little more irritable maybe than normal, tired, lethargic perhaps. And so a lot of people will take that day off to recover. My suggestion is actually to go to work that day, try to make it a lighter day if you can, and then take a day off later in the week, a Thursday or a Friday, when you feel better and you can actually engage with that hobby, that play, or engage with a day that really is restorative. Sabbath is really meant to be about doing things that are restorative and recreational. And so taking a day off later in the week, and try that for a couple of months. Pastors are sometimes surprised at what a big difference that makes. Great question.
Thanks, Chris. Go ahead. No, thanks, Chris.
I think just for time, Cody, I'll jump into the next dimension, but we can come back to some of those questions at the end if that's all right.
Perfect.
Great. So when we talk about resilience, we're talking about the capacity to roll with the punches, so to speak, to adapt. How psychologically hardy is someone to be able to go through difficult things and bounce back, or as a pastor tell me recently, he said, I think it should be bounced forward, that you can actually grow on the other side of adversity, which is true. This is where we talk about burnout that largely comes from the chronic interpersonal stress of ministry. We asked pastors in this research, what are the things that make it difficult to flourish over time? And there were many, many things they said to us, as you might imagine. These 4 themes were the top 4 themes. Complaints, and this is pre-COVID, by the way, complaints from parishioners, negative challenges from lay members, meaning they're challenging your pastoral identity in a global sense. You're a bad pastor in totality. because of A, B, or C. And what we find is that female clergy and pastors of color are more frequently and severely on the receiving end of those kind of comments that can be veiled sexism or veiled racism, even those kind of things. And that just gets old. Churches that demand the pastor conform to their expectations, which probably is every church to some extent, but this is talking about when that's really excessive, when there's not a mutually supportive, mutually respectful relationship between congregation and pastor, and sort of an appropriate deference to spiritual leadership. Not that there isn't accountability and all of that, but that's a very difficult work environment to flourish in. And then isolation, which comes up again and again and again. It's paradoxical in many ways because pastors are around people all the time. So it's kind of water everywhere, not a drop to drink sort of phenomenon. People are surprised to hear that it can be lonely. It can be socially and psychologically isolating to be a pastor. And I'll talk about more why I think that is in a second. I threw this slide in here because Lifeway Research did a multi-denominational study earlier in COVID. So this would have been last summer, July 2020, asking what are the most stressful pieces of this. And what I want you to notice here is the top one is maintaining unity in a polarized culture. So many pastors, regardless of denomination, are, having difficult conversations around masks, no masks. Do we open the church? Do we not open the church? Feeling pressure from parishioners to either preach their left-wing political agenda or their right-wing political agenda. And you've got all of that sitting in the congregation on any given Sunday. And it just has upped the ante with the conflict that is already there. Typically, it's exposed a lot of things maybe that were already there and brought them to the surface. So the interpersonal stress is what can lead to burnout, which involves these kinds of things: just exhaustion, emotionally especially, but also physically and mentally, not being able to really roll with the punches or adapt or feel like you're on your A game as much. And then at some point, people can just start asking, does this make any difference at all? What's the point? Is this even worth it? And start looking through the one ads in the newspaper and think, what else could I do? What other marketable skills do I have if I weren't a pastor or something? And most pastors have experienced that every now and then on a Monday, probably. But when that's pervasive and lasting, then that's something to pay attention to. But here's the insidious thing about ministry burnout. It sneaks up on us. Pastor after pastor after pastor has said to us in this research, I didn't see it coming. It hit me out of nowhere. It blindsided me. Well, the truth is, it was building through the mild and moderate phases outside of a person's awareness. And then it hits a threshold of severity and we're aware of it all of a sudden. And then the cost can be pretty high. So that begs a couple of questions. Number one, who in your life knows what the early warning signs of burnout look like in you and loves you enough to tell you that so that you can take action early before things progress to that severity level. But then also, how do we prevent it? And what we're finding prevents it are developing what the research calls self-regulatory capacities. It's just a simple way of talking about emotional intelligence kinds of competencies, if you're familiar with that concept. So self-awareness, what am I feeling, doing, and thinking, and what impact is that having on me and other people? Just to take a step back and pause. What am I feeling emotionally in my body? What am I thinking? How am I behaving? And how is that impacting me? How is that impacting the people I'm leading, the people I'm around? Then the self-reflection part is, well, why am I feeling, thinking, and doing what I'm feeling, thinking, and doing? Where's that coming from? What's getting triggered in me? What's at stake for me in this particular situation? What's getting activated in me? And then the self-control piece, which of course is a fruit of the Spirit, and we're created for this, is based on my self-awareness and self-reflection. How then will I choose to respond rather than knee-jerk react? And so this is very similar to the idea of emotional intelligence. I'm not going to take time to unpack this whole graph, but you can see high EQ as opposed to IQ is really predicated upon self-awareness. That cultivating self-awareness is absolutely essential for flourishing in ministry long term. In fact, what we find in this research is that clergy who have not done the hard work of getting to know themselves are not flourishing long term. That means knowing your strengths clearly and leading out of your strengths. It also means knowing your vulnerabilities and being proactive about what you need to pay attention to uniquely in order to continue to flourish. And then that self-awareness leads to the capacity to self-regulate, leads to the capacity to be socially aware and to do well interpersonally as well. And we can all grow in this. That's what the research tells us. And there are different things that can help us grow that you see here: meditation, learning to identify our feelings, primary and secondary emotions. If you're not familiar with that distinction, anger is a good example. Anger is actually a secondary emotion. It's a feeling about other feelings. So there's often something underneath the anger to understand and identify and process. Revisiting our family of origin, and I imagine you might talk about this in the next webinar about family systems. Our own internalized family system from what we grew up with can impact how we respond to conflict, to anxiety, to the family system of the church that we're leading. So it's important to revisit that. Acknowledge hidden losses. There are lots of ambiguous forms of grief in ministry leadership, and we cannot grieve something we haven't named. And so to name what those hidden losses are and help yourself through that grief process like you do everybody else in life. Christian mindfulness practices, journaling. And then you see at the bottom here, I do a lot of work doing psychological evaluations of clergy candidates for various denominations that require that as part of the ordination process. And probably the three most common recommendations I make for their development are what you see here: the anger management, conflict resolution, and assertiveness skills. Most of us that go into ministry are nice people. We tend to be lovers, not fighters, generally speaking, to the point that we can even be conflict avoidant or overly passive or people pleasers. So to develop assertiveness skills, which is different than aggressiveness, but it's also different than being passive. It's being clear in a way that's not overbearing, can be an enormous asset to pastors as well. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's a question or two about resilience.
I think we're good for now, Chris.
Okay, very good. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, so you'll want to go back and look at this PowerPoint. Thriving is the next dimension. And this is about connectedness to God and to meaning and purpose, but also connectedness to other people. And one of the things that makes pastoral ministry isolating, I think, is that people are relating more to your role than they are to who you actually are just as a person. And they're relating to what they psychologically project onto your role. It's what psychologists call transference. And people are primarily relating to you that way instead of who you actually are as a leader, as a person. And so that's one of the things that can be isolating. So it's important to have some key kinds of relationships in your life to counteract that isolation. And we use the metaphor of a stage. You see here, we're looking from backstage across the front stage into a theater as a metaphor. And we all need three kinds of relationships we're finding. We need front stage relationships. What happens on the front stage? That's when you're in a public role. You're teaching, you're preaching, you're administering sacraments, you're officiating weddings and funerals and baby dedications and all those kinds of things. And we need to have allies in ministry, those people that share that front stage. They're on board with our leadership, with the mission of the church. They're supportive, they're mutually respectful. Important to have those people. They may not necessarily be personal confidants, nor should they be, but they're allies. We need backstage relationships. What happens on the backstage? We rehearse for what happens on the front stage. We debrief it. We think about the technical aspects of it. We strategically plan. And we need relationships with people that that get the behind the scenes stuff. So that could be other pastoral staff. It could be whoever you report to in your ecclesial system. I know that's a two-way relationship, trust me, but to the extent you can build a mutually supportive relationship with whoever you report to, it helps pastors flourish. Having a mentor at every stage in a career, and then having a community of practice, like this group that you're online with right now. Other people that do what you do, that get your world. What we find is that clergy don't hang out with each other nearly as much as other helping professions hang out with each other. And there could be a variety of reasons for that, but when clergy can get together regularly over a long period of time and get to a place of trust and safety and vulnerability and accountability, it's enormously life-giving over time. And it's wonderful that the Hope and Healing Center can perhaps be a catalyst or help that kind of thing to happen. And then we all need an offstage. When and where and with whom do you get to just be a person? To laugh spontaneously, to vent about your church board if you want to have fears, to cry, to just be who you totally spontaneously are. And if you're married, then hopefully in a healthy marriage, that's a place where you can be fully known and know and be loved. I also recommend that you have at least one close personal friendship outside of your congregation, because they're outside of that relational system. And they don't primarily relate to you as your role. They relate to you just as Chris or Don or Cody or whomever. And a place to be just a person on a regular basis can be very important as well. And then finally, we'll just talk about authenticity. Given all the demands, what we're finding is that it can be difficult to have a true self kind of expression in ministry, because there's so many expectations that people have of the role and many expectations we have of ourselves. To be an expert generalist, to be an expert in every area, when the truth is most of us are specialists. So what you see here are the macro categories of a job analysis of clergy, which is something that personnel psychologists do. And all these categories have subcategories to them. In fact, there were 65 core competencies that we discovered it would be nice to have expertise in to be a pastor. Now, that's really probably humanly impossible. In fact, the researcher that did that job analysis said to us, who would ever try this? This is a setup to feel inadequate, because most of us are going to be naturally gifted or trained in about a third of these competencies. We'll have threshold competencies, meaning good enough competencies, in another third. And then the other third are not our strength. And so what do we do with that dilemma? We can either try to get great at things we're not very good at, or we can give ourselves permission to be ourselves and lead out of our strengths at least 60% of the time. Seems to be kind of the threshold. If you can configure your role and your time management around your strengths, passions, gifts, more of the time than not. Knowing that every pastoral role comes with stuff that you never trained for, you never thought you would have to do with your time, whether that's fixing the plumbing in the church or whatever, that comes with the territory. Over time, over the course of, say, a year or more, staying in the neighborhood of your strengths tends to prevent burnout and promote flourishing. And thinking about that role, what we call job crafting around what you're good at, your personality, but then also what you value most. And that's where we find the goodness of fit is a really big deal. Of a particular clergy person with a particular congregation in a particular context and community. What do you value most in your personal theology? Let's say that's social justice, for example, which is of course wonderful. And if you're placed or you choose to be in a congregation where they don't really care about social justice and they don't want to learn to care about it, that's going to be a difficult fit and going to erode flourishing over time. So this fit a pastor with context is a really big deal. So there's some things we can do to help ourselves here. Cultivate self-acceptance, which I think is closer to the biblical notion of humility. It's okay to know your strengths and to feel good about those. Pride, I think, is the overinflated, inaccurate self-perception. But knowing your strengths and leading with those, but in such a way that you know that it's not about you. It's about other people, that God has given you those gifts. I threw this in here because this is sort of hot off the press, but fascinating to me. If you can end your day on a high note every day, at least for 15 minutes, go back to something that brings you the most joy in ministry. It's not going to take away the bad day, but if you do that every day, day after day, week after week, it will make an enormous difference over time to promoting flourishing and preventing burnout. Just to stay in touch with the joy, with the core of why you responded to God's call into this work to begin with. Put people around you with complementary strengths, whether those are lay leaders or other pastoral staff, to round out all those competencies as a team. It's just a much more sustainable way to go. And then develop financial literacy, I put in there because it shows up again and again and again in the clergy literature on stress, that it's not so much not getting hugely wealthy doing this work. It's more not having been trained in money management kinds of things, whether that's personal finances or congregational finances. So if you haven't taken yourself through a financial management workshop of some kind or met with a personal financial planner, encourage you to do that, because when we have a sense of efficacy in that area, we know what to do with whatever money we do have, then it reduces the stress associated with finances. It doesn't eliminate it, but it gives us more of a sense of mastery in that area, which can help promote flourishing as well. So, okay, so that is flourishing. I just want to mention briefly, we'll do some questions and answers. There is a free phone app for smartphone and iPhone that you can follow these directions here, download, and it takes about 20 minutes to fill out the survey. And then it'll give you a personalized readout on how you're doing in all these 4 dimensions. And then it will suggest practices to you based on your results that can boost your well-being and promote your flourishing over the long haul. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And I think we've got a little bit of time for questions.